I can still taste the promethium. Not the burning kind that turns men into screaming torches, though I've tasted that too, second-hand, when the wind shifts wrong and carries the residue back through the vision slits. No, I mean the raw stuff, the unburned fuel that seeps into everything when you live inside a hellhound for months at a time. It gets into your pores, your lungs, the back of your throat. You sweat it. You piss it. After a while, you can't remember what clean air tastes like. Only variations of chemical sweetness layered over the ever-present metallic tang of recycled oxygen and your own fear. They told us we were the Emperor's flame made manifest, purifying fire for the unclean. Holy wrath in a 70-ton package. What they didn't tell us was how small the universe becomes when you're sealed inside a metal coffin. With 2 other people you'll grow to hate more than the enemy, rolling through streets where every window is a potential firing position and every pile of rubble might hide a crack grenade. They didn't tell us that the Hellhound's inferno cannon makes you a priority target for everyone with a gun, and that urban warfare turns every city block into a maze where your advantages mean nothing and your vulnerabilities multiply like vermin in the walls. My name was Trooper Kennick Vorse, loader and secondary gunner for Hellhound No. 737, call sign Mercy's End, 3rd Armored Company, attached to the 58th Penal Legion during the pacification of Hive Tertius. When I say my name was, I mean that the person I was before we rolled into those streets doesn't exist anymore. When I say is, I mean the thing I've become still wears his name like a uniform that no longer fits. The distinction matters less than you'd think. Names are just sounds. Inside the Hellhound, we had different designations: driver, commander, loader. Those titles meant something. They defined your tiny kingdom of responsibilities in a space barely larger than a burial vault. I remember the city before we entered it, or what was left of it. Hive Tertius had been a mid-tier manufacturing district, 60 million souls stacked in hab blocks and factorums that scraped the polluted sky. Then the uprising came. Workers first, then PDF units, then half the administratum staff. By the time we arrived, it was a corpse city, hollowed out and occupied by what Command called insurgent elements. What that meant, practically, was that every civilian who hadn't fled or been executed was now a potential combatant, every building a potential stronghold, and our orders were to clear it street by street, block by block, until nothing that could hold a gun remained standing. The Hellhound is not built for subtlety. It's built to announce itself, to make noise and fire and terror. The Inferno cannon's roar is unmistakable, a wet, sucking ignition followed by a sustained howl as pressurized promethium sprays through the air and catches light. You feel it in your bones when it fires, even inside the crew compartment. The whole tank shudders. The temperature spikes. The smell intensifies. And somewhere out there, beyond the armor plating, something that used to be human becomes something else entirely. But here's what nobody tells you about urban warfare in a Hellhound. You're blind. The vision blocks give you slices of the world, narrow, distorted slices that show you fragments of streets and buildings but never the whole picture. The commander has the cupola, rotating his periscope, desperately trying to track threats from 360 degrees. The driver has his forward blocks, focused on not crashing into rubble or falling into a crater. And I have my loader's position, wedged between ammunition racks and the Inferno cannon's feed mechanism, with one tiny slit to peer through when I'm not ramming fuel canisters into the breech or checking pressure gauges. We rolled into Hive Tertius on a morning that tasted like ash and industrial runoff. The sky was the color of old bruises, heavy with smoke from fires that had been burning for weeks. Our column stretched behind us, Lehman Russes, Chimeras, more Hellhounds, and the expendable masses of the Penal Legion on foot, urged forward by commissars and shock mauls. We were the vanguard's vanguard, the ones who would burn out the first line of resistance so the infantry could advance into the ruins. Commander Guest gave us the brief in his typical style. Minimal words, maximum contempt. Guest was 43 years old but looked 60, face like weathered leather, eyes permanently squinted from years of peering through vision blocks. He'd survived 7 campaigns before Tertius, which made him ancient by armored warfare standards. He had a superstition about talking too much before an engagement said it invited the Emperor's gaze. And you never wanted the Emperor looking too closely at what you were about to do. We go in, we burn the primary approaches, we withdraw. Simple, he said, his voice crackling through the internal vox. Vorse, you keep the feed clean. Mekit, you keep us moving. Nobody plays hero. We're a crematorium on treads, not a throne-damned crusader. Mekit was our driver, a thin, twitchy man from some agri world whose name I never learned to pronounce. He'd been transferred to armor duty as punishment for some infraction involving stolen rations and a commissar's daughter, or maybe it was a commissar's rations and stolen daughter. The story changed depending on who told it and how drunk they were. What mattered was that Mekit could drive, had quick reflexes, and never questioned orders. That last quality was the most important. In a Hellhound crew, doubt gets people killed. The city swallowed us street by street. The first day was almost routine advance. Stop. Burn out suspected positions. Advance again. The buildings pressed in on both sides. Hab blocks and factorums covered in layers of Imperial propaganda that was now bullet-pocked and peeling. Slogans praising the Emperor's mercy. Exhortations to productivity. Warnings against sedition. All of it meaningless now. Just wallpaper for corpses. We saw our first contact around midday. Movement in a third-story window, 600 meters out. Kest called it immediately, voice flat and professional. Loader. Ready inferno cannon. Target. Structure. 12-7. Third level. Center. Window. Driver. Halt. And angle. 15 degrees port. I was already moving before he finished. Muscle memory taking over. Check pressure good. Verify feed clear. Fuel mixture nominal. The process took seconds, each action flowing into the next. My hands knew the sequence better than my brain did. There's a comfort in that kind of automation, a way to keep thinking at bay when thinking would make you hesitate. Ready, I reported. Fire. The world compressed into noise and heat and chemical stink. The inferno cannon spat its payload across the distance, a stream of liquid fire that arced through the air and splashed against the building like the Emperor's own judgment. The window disappeared in a ball of orange and white. The flames clung to the structure, spreading along wooden frames and ancient insulation, finding every combustible thing and consuming it with systematic hunger. If there had been someone in that window, they weren't anymore. If there had been anything in the rooms beyond, it was carbon now. Target neutralized, Jest said. Advance. Mekit dropped us back into gear, and we rolled forward. The building burned behind us, adding its smoke to the city's perpetual haze. I didn't think about who might have been inside. You learn not to think about that. You learn to trust that command knows what they're doing, that the targets are legitimate, that the Emperor's will flows through the chain of command down to you and the weapon you serve. You learn to trust, or you learn to stop sleeping, and the Emperor needs his soldiers rested. But here's the thing about trust in urban warfare. It's a luxury you can't afford for long, because the city fights back in ways you can't predict or prepare for. The enemy doesn't line up in neat firing positions. They don't wear uniforms or carry standards. They pop up from storm drains and subway tunnels, from collapsed buildings and hidden basements, from places that shouldn't exist and angles that shouldn't be possible. They know the terrain. They know the buildings. They know which walls are real and which are facades, which streets have good drainage, and which will trap a 70-ton tank in 5 centimeters of standing water mixed with sewage and blood. By the third day, we'd learned to hate the Vox. Every crackle brought new orders, new coordinates, new buildings to burn. Forward, forward, always forward. Never mind that we couldn't see what we were shooting at half the time. Never mind that the infantry behind us was taking casualties from snipers and improvised explosives. Never mind that the city seemed to regenerate overnight. New barricades appearing where we'd cleared the day before. New fighters replacing the ones we'd burned. The taste of promethium intensified. It was in everything now: our rations, our water, even the recycled air that whistled through the ventilation system. Mekit started coughing on the fourth day. Wet, rattling coughs that echoed in the crew compartment. Guest told him to shut up. He did, mostly, but I could hear him anyway. Feel the shuddering in the driver's seat, transmitted through the tank's frame. On the fifth day, we found the tunnel. We'd been advancing down what the tactical map called Avenue Primaris, a main thoroughfare that cut through the district toward the central administratum complex. The street was wider than most, flanked by 6-story hab blocks that leaned toward each other like conspirators sharing secrets. The buildings showed damaged shell impacts, burn marks, windows shattered and dark. But they were still standing, still providing cover for whatever was inside. Jest called for a halt while he conferred with company command. We sat idling, engine rumbling, while the Vox crackled with distant voices discussing things above our authorization level. I used the pause to check our fuel reserves. We'd burned through 40% of our promethium load in 5 days. At this rate, we'd need resupply within the week, assuming the supply lines could reach us, assuming they weren't already cut by insurgent action behind our advance. That's when I noticed the smell. It was different from the usual promethium and burning reek. This was older, damper, like earth and mold, and something else I couldn't identify. Something organic and wrong. I mentioned it to Guest through the internal Vox. "Sir, you smell that?" "I smell promethium and your fear sweat, Force." "Be more specific." "It's different, sir. Coming from, I think, from below." Jest went quiet for a moment. Then, "Mekit, kill the engine." The Hellhound shuddered into silence. In the sudden quiet, we could hear it, the city breathing. Not wind, not settling rubble, something underneath. A susurrus of movement and air flowing through spaces that shouldn't be there. And yes, that smell, stronger now, rising through the deck plates. "There's a tunnel network," Guest said. Not a question, but a realization. Command didn't brief us on tunnels. Maybe Command doesn't know. I offered. "Command always knows," Guest said, which wasn't true, but was the kind of thing you said to keep the universe ordered. "They just don't always tell us." The Vox crackled. Company command was sending us new coordinates, a position 3 blocks forward and 2 to starboard. We were to proceed immediately and clear a suspected weapons cache in a Factorum basement. Jest acknowledged, and Mekit brought the engine back online with a diesel roar that seemed profane in the near silence we'd just experienced. We advanced. The streets narrowed again, forcing Mekit to navigate carefully between rubble piles and abandoned vehicles. Twice we had to stop and reverse, finding our path blocked by collapsed buildings or barricades too substantial to push through. Each time we stopped, I felt the city watching us through 1,000 dark windows, felt the weight of streets and tunnels pressing down and in. The Factorum was a squat, reinforced structure, built in the old-style thick rockcrete walls, narrow windows, a heavy blast door hanging askew on broken hinges. Guest studied it through his periscope, taking his time. I could hear him breathing over the Vox, slow and measured. Commander's breathing. Thinking, breathing. "Something wrong?" I asked, then immediately regretted it. You don't question the commander's hesitation. Hesitation means he's seen something you haven't, and pointing it out breaks his concentration. But Guest didn't reprimand me. "Too quiet," he said. "Should be activity if there's a cache. Guards, lookouts. Something. Maybe they ran when they heard us coming. Maybe." He didn't sound convinced. "Mekit, position us 40 meters out. Angle to give us clear line on that entrance. Vorse, ready the inferno cannon. We're going to light up that doorway. See what comes out." I went through the sequence again. Check, verify, ready. My hands were steadier than they had any right to be. 6 days of constant tension had worn away normal fear responses, replacing them with a kind of numb efficiency. I was a component of the Hellhound now, a piece of the machine, and the machine did what it was built to do. "Ready, sir." "On my mark." 3, 2, the building erupted. Not exploded, erupted. like something massive had been crouched inside and suddenly stood up, ripping through the roof and walls in a shower of rockcrete and twisted metal. For a fraction of a second, I saw it through my vision slit. A shape that was wrong, too many angles and edges, something that gleamed wetly in the polluted daylight and seemed to fold in on itself even as it expanded outward. Then the world was thunder and impact. Something hit us from the side, not the building. Something else. Something that had been waiting in the street or the adjoining alley. The Hellhound lurched violently. Meket screamed. The vision slit showed me spinning impressions of sky and street and buildings rotating past too fast to process. We'd been hit. We were moving. No, we were tipping. The Hellhound tilted sideways, gravity pulling wrong, equipment rattling loose from its mountings. I grabbed for a handhold and missed. Slammed shoulder first into the fuel canisters. One of them split open, and suddenly the crew compartment was full of promethium vapor. Invisible death that would ignite if anything sparked. Breach! Breach! I was shouting into the vox, but my voice sounded distant, unimportant. We're breaching! Jest was yelling something, orders or curses or prayers, impossible to tell. Meket was still screaming. The Hellhound kept tilting, and I realized with crystalline clarity that we were going over, falling into something, and that when we hit bottom the impact would kill us, or the fuel would ignite and kill us, or the enemy would pour in through the hatches and kill us. 3 different deaths racing to see which arrived first. The impact, when it came, was almost gentle. We hit at an angle, slid, and settled with a groan of tortured metal. The promethium vapor hung in the air like a held breath. In the sudden stillness, I could hear dripping fuel, or coolant, or something worse. And underneath that, the sound that had been haunting me since we stopped earlier. Breathing. The city breathing. The tunnels breathing. We were in them now. However we'd been hit, whoever had hit us, they'd knocked us into the tunnel network that supposedly didn't exist. The vision slit showed nothing but darkness, and a faint, diseased luminescence that might have been chemical spill, or might have been something else. Status. Jest croaked. His voice was rough, like he'd been the one screaming. Maybe he had been. Sound off. Loader operational, I managed. Fuel breach. Atmosphere contaminated. We need to purge, or we're sitting in a bomb. Driver? Meket didn't respond immediately. Then, small and frightened. Can't see. Can't see anything, Commander. The blocks are. Something's covering the blocks. What do you mean covering? I mean something's on the other side, pressed against them. Moving. I didn't want to look through my vision slit. Didn't want to confirm what Meket was seeing. But discipline and terror drove me anyway. And I pressed my face against the viewer and stared into the darkness outside. Things were moving out there. Not people. Not quite. They had the wrong proportions. Limbs that bent at angles that suggested multiple joints or no joints at all. They moved with a fluidity that was almost liquid, sliding past the Hellhound like oil flowing around an obstacle, and they were touching it, running what might have been hands or appendages along the armor. Tapping, testing, searching for a way in. Contact, I reported, my voice steady through pure dissociation. Multiple hostiles, immediate proximity, nature unknown. Can you identify? Negative, sir, they're not. I don't know what they are. The tapping intensified, became drumming, became pounding. Something was hitting the side hatch. Methodical impacts that sent reverberations through the crew compartment. Testing the locks, learning the mechanisms. Problem solving. Jest was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a new quality, something I'd never heard before from him. Uncertainty. Command, this is 737. We are down, repeat, down. Position unknown, possibly in subterranean infrastructure. Request immediate support and extraction. We have contact with hostiles of unknown classification. Please advise. Static answered him. The Vox had gone dead, either from damage or from the sheer mass of earth and rockcrete now between us and the surface. We were alone in the dark with things that shouldn't exist, sealed in a mobile crematorium that had become our tomb. The promethium fumes were making me lightheaded. I could taste them on every breath now, thick and sweet and wrong. My vision was starting to blur at the edges, grey static creeping in. I knew I should be checking the breach, trying to patch it, doing something useful. But the tapping, pounding, testing continued, hypnotic in its persistence, and I found myself listening instead, trying to understand the rhythm, looking for meaning in the pattern. That's when I realized it wasn't random. The impacts were following a sequence, repeating every 7 beats with slight variations. Communication? Coordination? Something analyzing our defenses with systematic precision? They're learning the tank, I said aloud. What? Guest's voice was sharp. The way they're hitting it. They're learning the structure, mapping it. They're going to find a way in. Meket made a sound that might have been a sob or a laugh. What are they? Good question. In 6 days of urban warfare, we'd fought human insurgents, faced down improvised explosives and ambushes, and all the conventional horrors of street fighting. This was something else. Something that lived in the spaces below the city, that moved wrong and thought wrong, and had been waiting down here in the dark for someone to fall into its domain. The pounding stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the noise. I strained to hear anything through the vision slit, but the darkness outside had gone still. The things had withdrawn or gone silent or were preparing for something. My heart hammered against my ribs, loud enough that it seemed impossible the things outside couldn't hear it. Meket, Guest said quietly. Can you move us? I can try, Commander. If the tracks aren't damaged, if we're not wedged in, try. The engine was still running somehow. Impossibly. After the fall and the impact, the Hellhound's power plant continued its faithful rumble. Meket worked the controls, and I felt the tank shudder, treads biting into whatever surface we'd landed on. Metal squealed. Something underneath us cracked with a sound like breaking bones. We lurched forward 1/2 meter, then stopped. We're caught, Meket reported. Something's blocking the left track. Debris. Or what? It feels wrong, Commander. The resistance. It's not grinding against metal or concrete. It's softer. Like we're caught on. The thing that had been blocking us moved. I felt it through the deck plates. A massive shift of weight and pressure. The Hellhound tilted again. Not falling this time, but being lifted. Rotated with deliberate force. We were being handled, manipulated by something strong enough to maneuver a 70-ton tank like a child's toy. Meket was screaming again. I might have been too. The world spun outside the vision slits, darkness and diseased light trading places, up becoming down, becoming sideways. Equipment broke loose, fuel canisters tumbling through the crew compartment. One of them struck me in the shoulder, sent me spinning into the breach mechanism. I tasted blood, realized I'd bitten through my lip. Then we were moving, being dragged or carried through the tunnel system by whatever had caught us. The motion was smooth despite our size, almost gentle, and that gentleness was more terrifying than violence would have been. It suggested capability, suggested intelligence, suggested purpose. The vox crackled suddenly, not with words but with something else, a sound like breathing. But wrong, too rhythmic, too regular. Mechanical breathing, or something imitating mechanical breathing. The sound filled the crew compartment, mixing with the promethium fumes and the smell of my own blood and fear. Emperor, protect us, Guest whispered, and I realized that I'd never heard him pray before. Not once in 6 days of warfare. His certainty had been our anchor, his conviction that we were doing the Emperor's work, the foundation of our shared reality. Hearing him invoke divine protection now meant that foundation had cracked, meant we were in a space where normal order didn't apply. The movement stopped. The breathing on the vox continued, patient and expectant. Through my vision slit, I could see that we'd been brought into a larger space, some kind of chamber carved from the living rock beneath the city. The walls were covered with something that reflected the diseased luminescence, not clean metal or rockcrete, but something organic-looking, ribbed and glistening. And everywhere, crawling across the surfaces, moving in patterns that hurt to follow, were the things we'd seen earlier. Hundreds of them. Thousands. One of them approached the vision slit, and I got my first clear look. It had been human once. The basic architecture was still there, head, torso, limbs, but reshaped, redesigned, improved according to some aesthetic that had nothing to do with the Emperor's image. The skull had been opened and expanded, the cranium now housing machinery that pulsed with faint light. The eyes were gone, replaced by clusters of lenses that whirred and focused independently. The mouth had been widened, deepened, turned into something that could accommodate tools or weapons or both. The limbs ended in hands that were part flesh, part metal, part something else that seemed to shift between states as I watched. And it was looking at me, those lens clusters focused on my vision slit with obvious intelligence, obvious awareness. It tilted its head in a gesture that was almost quizzical, almost human. Then it tapped on the armor plating, right next to my face. 3 precise impacts, a greeting, or a warning, or a promise. The breathing on the Vox resolved into words. Not High Gothic. Not Low Gothic. Not any language I recognized, but somehow comprehensible anyway. Meaning transmitted directly into my brain through some mechanism that bypassed language entirely. Brothers. Cousins. Variations on a theme. You have been improved by your machine. We have been improved by ours. Should we not share our innovations? What? I started to say, but Jest cut me off. Don't answer it. Don't engage. That's not human anymore. That's tech heresy. That's. But I understood now. I understood what we'd found, or what had found us. The uprising in Hive Tertius hadn't been political or economic. It had been theological. Someone had been preaching a different kind of faith down here in the dark, a different relationship with the machine. Not the Mechanicus's approved doctrine of supplication and ritual, something more intimate, more mutual, more transformative. They'd been changing themselves, or being changed, merging with technology in ways that the Imperium would never sanction, and they'd been waiting in the tunnels, converting infrastructure workers and maintenance crews, and anyone who ventured too far from the Emperor's light, building their congregation in the spaces between, growing their numbers, preparing for the day when they'd emerge and show the Imperium their version of the machine's blessing. We'd fallen right into their sanctuary. The thing outside tapped again, more insistent. More things were gathering around the Hellhound now, clustering thick, pressing close. I could hear them working at the hatches, hear servos whining and metal grinding as they applied their enhanced strength to our locks. We had minutes at most before they breached us, maybe less. We have to burn them, I heard myself say. What? Meckett's voice was shrill with panic. The Inferno cannon. We're sitting in a fuel bomb anyway. We might as well. That would kill us too, Guest pointed out. But his tone suggested he was considering it. Better than what they'll do to us. Better than becoming that. The breathing on the Vox intensified, as if whatever was transmitting understood what we were discussing and found it amusing. Resistance is inefficient, it said in that not voice. Your machine needs you. We need your machine. Together, we will achieve optimization. Together, we will show the Mechanicus what true communion looks like. Over my corpse, Guest snarled. That can be arranged. Though we prefer living material. The integration proceeds more smoothly when the original consciousness remains aware during the first stages. Your faith in the Emperor will make the transition particularly educational. Jest looked at me through the cramped space of the crew compartment. His face was grey in the diseased light filtering through the vision slits, older than ever, but his eyes were clear. Commander's eyes, deciding eyes. Vorse, he said quietly. Do you remember the purging protocols? I did. They drilled it into us during training. If your Hellhound is about to be captured by the enemy, if there's any risk of the technology falling into heretical hands, you have a duty to destroy it completely. There's a sequence fuel dump, ignition, catastrophic detonation. It would vaporize everything in a 50-meter radius, maybe more in an enclosed space like this. Us, them, the tunnel walls, everything. I remember, sir. Then prepare it. We have one duty left to the Emperor, and it's not to let these things have our machine. Mechit was sobbing now, but he didn't argue. He knew as well as we did what the Mechanicus would do to anyone who allowed a Hellhound to be captured and corrupted. Assuming we survived, assuming we ever made it back to Imperial lines, the best we could hope for would be summary execution. More likely would be months of interrogation followed by servitor conversion. We were dead men already. This way, at least, we'd die as soldiers. I started the sequence. It took longer than I expected. My hands were shaking. Promethium fumes were still thick in the air, making me clumsy. And some part of me was screaming that there had to be another way, some escape we hadn't considered. But there wasn't. The things outside were almost through the hatches. I could hear the mechanisms beginning to fail, hear locks giving way under sustained pressure. "Emperor, forgive us," Guest said, and I wasn't sure if he meant for what we'd done in 6 days of burning the city, or for what we were about to do, or for both. The purge sequence entered its final stage. Fuel was being routed from storage directly into the crew compartment now, flooding the space with liquid promethium that splashed over my boots and rose with alarming speed. The smell intensified beyond anything I'd experienced before. Chemical sweetness, so thick it was like breathing syrup. I could feel it in my lungs, coating my throat, filling my sinuses. Outside, the things had noticed the change. Their working at the hatches became frantic, desperate. They understood what we were doing now, understood that their prize was about to become a bomb. The not voice on the Vox was screaming, actual screaming this time, rage and betrayal, and something that might have been grief. "No, we could have elevated you. We could have made you perfect. Why choose oblivion over transcendence?" "Because," Guest said calmly, his hand on the final trigger, "we serve the Emperor, not efficiency, not optimization, not your twisted version of the machine. We serve, and that service ends only one way." He pulled the trigger. For a fraction of a second, I felt the ignition, a spark meeting vapor, meeting liquid, chemical reaction beginning its exponential expansion. I felt heat, saw light brighter than the sun, tasted one final burst of promethium sweetness, mixed with burning air and vaporized metal. Then nothing, or not quite nothing, something, awareness without senses, thought without a body to think with. I was still present somehow, still observing, but the I doing the observing had become unmoored from physical existence. Was this death, the Emperor's judgment, or something worse? I became aware of voices, not the Vox, not the not voice of the tunnel dwellers, something else. Imperial voices, talking in clipped, professional tones about recovery operations and casualty assessment and unusual readings from the blast site. 3 crew members, all Kia. Tank suffered catastrophic detonation, but external damage suggests prior engagement with unknown hostiles. Tunnels in this sector show signs of extensive modification, not standard infrastructure, recommending full quarantine and Mechanicus investigation. Noted. Mark the location for follow-up. Move to next, grid square. Sir, there's something else. The crew compartment. Even after the explosion, even burned this badly, there's residue that doesn't match anything in our database. Organic in nature, but showing metallic properties. Mechanicus will want samples. Then they can retrieve them themselves. Our orders are to secure the surface level, not investigate every anomaly in the underlayers. Tag it and move on. The voices faded. Awareness faded with them. I felt myself dissipating, spreading thin, becoming part of the ash and smoke and chemical residue that marked where Hellhound 737 had made its final stand, where Kennick Vorse had made his final choice. But even as I faded, I felt something else. A presence in the ruins, a stirring in the residue. The tunnel dwellers hadn't all died in the blast. Some had survived, retreated deeper into their network, and they were adapting, learning, incorporating this new data into their understanding. The Purge protocol had taught them something. The sacrifice had given them information. They were still down there, still growing, still changing. And now, they knew what we would do to stop them, knew the limits of our resistance, knew exactly how far we'd go, and what we'd sacrifice. That knowledge would make them stronger, more careful, more effective. We'd died to deny them one tank, but in dying, we'd given them something more valuable. Understanding of Imperial resolve, understanding of our tactics, understanding of how to counter both. The taste of promethium is the last thing I remember. Sweet and chemical and wrong, coating everything, defining everything, becoming everything. In the end, I didn't burn the enemy. I just burned. We all just burned. And the city went on breathing beneath us, patient and eternal, waiting for the next crew to fall into its depths, waiting to teach them what it means to crew a Hellhound in urban warfare, waiting to show them that some fires don't purify. Some fires just spread,